People talk about regret like it's a vague, distant sort of pain. But when you've lived through certain nights, regret burrows under your skin like splinters, sharp every time you remember to breathe. That night, starting out as innocuous as any other game night we'd planned, changed everything. It was my turn to pick the game. Tucked behind other board games that Scott, Elsie, and I had played to death in my cramped living room was the strange box I'd picked up from an estate sale just that week. There was no real artwork, just old, tattered leather and a faded golden embossing that said Veritas. It intrigued me more than it should have. Inside, a simple board, pieces that looked like they were carved out of bone, and a set of rules written in neat cursive on yellowed paper. If only we'd paid more attention to those rules. Not that they made much sense, seeming more like the ramblings of a mad poet than anything else. Never play as the crow flies, one warned. Never spill blood over the game, read another. We'd chuckled over each line, the wine flowing freely as rain that drizzled against the window panes of my tiny dining room. Is this supposed to be a horror game or what? Scott had laughed, his arm casually draped over Elsie's shoulders. It seems more like a prank. Elsie was always the skeptic among us, her eyes scrunched in suspicion. These rules make no sense. Shrugging off the uneasiness that pinched the back of my neck, I spread out the game board. The pieces were unsettling, heavily detailed, and unnervingly cold to the touch. We chose our pieces randomly, laughing as I ended up with a grotesquely grinning cat. The game began innocently enough. Roll the dice, move the piece, draw a card from the stack. The tasks on the cards started simple. Confess a truth you've never told, one card commanded. Scott confessed to stealing a pack of gum as a kid. We laughed. Another card asked me to stand and not sit until my next turn. But as the night deepened and more wine was poured, the air around us became charged, heavy like the pressure before a storm. The room grew perceptibly colder. Jackets were pulled tighter, complaints about my cheap heating were mumbled. Elsie drew a card and read it out loud hesitantly. Swap a secret with your neighbor. Do not lie, for Veritas knows. Her skeptical smirk faded a bit as she looked up, meeting my eyes. We swapped relatively mundane secrets, but the air felt thick, words heavier than they should have seemed. I don't like this, I admitted, a cold sweat forming at the base of my spine despite the chill. It feels weird. Oh, come on, Scott interrupted, his usual bravado taking over. It's just a game, right? Let's at least finish it. As the night wore on, the cards grew stranger, more personal. The tasks asked for thoughts we were afraid of, memories we'd buried. With each reveal, the room felt smaller, our laughter more strained. At a particularly tense moment, Scott grew frustrated, his hand sweeping across the board, sending pieces clattering to the floor, the cat landing point first. A small but distinct line of blood welled up from a cut on my finger. It had happened so fast. Elsie gasped. Scott apologized profusely, but the air shifted, charged with something indescribable. I remembered the rule, never spill blood over the game. A shiver of real fear coursed through me. We should have stopped there. Game over, good night, thanks for playing. But we didn't. We laughed it off, patched up my finger, and continued, drawing another card, ignoring the gnawing feeling in our guts. With each turn, the consequences felt more real, more terrifying, not from within the game, but seeping out, staining the very fabric of our reality. Whispers that had no discernible source, cold drafts that seemed to slice through us sharper than any winter chill. When I finally drew a card that read, "End the game as the crow flies," confusion washed over me. The game had no clear ending. How do you end something that you don't fully understand? Elsie stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice quavering, hair clinging to the sweat on her forehead. "Something's wrong here." Scott looked at me, concern etching deep lines around his eyes. "Maybe we should just pack it up." But as I reached out to fold the board, every light in the house flickered out. In the suffocating darkness, Elsie's scream pierced the air, a sound I never thought capable from her. And then, a whisper, no, not a whisper, something harsher, a rasping, guttural utterance that seemed to come from right next to us, spoke a single word: continue. And in that moment, I knew we were no longer playing the game. The game was playing us. Trembling as the unnerving voice faded, Scott blindly reached out, his hand finding mine in the darkness. Our grips tightened, a lifeline in the pitch-black room. The power outage, unnaturally, silent and sudden, quickly pressed heavy against our chests as we struggled with the implications of what we should do next. Elsie's breaths came in quick, ragged pulls. I could hear her moving, likely pacing in an attempt to make sense of the chaos. The urge to leave was palpable, to just walk out and never look back. But the game's sinister whisper of "continue" echoed in our minds, rooting us to the spot. "Okay," Scott's voice finally broke the silence, strained but determined. "Okay, let's think. It wants us to continue. Maybe if we finish it, it lets us go." Neither Elsie nor I responded. The idea of completing the game seemed increasingly like stepping willingly into a spider's web. Without any real plan, I fumbled in the dark until my fingers brushed against the coarse edge of the game board. As they traced the surface, a sudden spark flickered from the wall socket, briefly illuminating the room with a ghostly glow. The bone pieces were scattered, and in that fleeting light, they seemed almost to twitch. Elsie stopped moving. "Did you see that?" Her voice trembled more than I'd ever heard. "Yes," I whispered back, unsure if the fear or the darkness made it difficult to speak louder. It was Scott who moved first, groping around until he found a flashlight in a drawer. Its beam was weak, but sufficient to clamp down the shadows to just the edges of the room. We watched him, fixated as he reassembled the game. "The rules," I muttered, remembering the cryptic scribbles. "We need to understand the rules." But taking a closer look at them now, the words seemed different, slippery, as if each time our eyes glanced away, they rearranged themselves into something freshly nonsensical. The more we tried to understand, the heavier the air felt, as if the game fed on our confusion. Elsie, with a sudden burst of resolve, grabbed the rule sheet. "Forget this," she started tearing it, each rip sounding unnaturally loud in the stifled environment. But as she did, a sound erupted from the game itself, a low, moaning groan, as if the board were in pain. We all froze, staring as the torn pieces of the rule paper seemed to dissolve into nothing before they even hit the ground. "It's not just a game," Scott said, the flashlight's beam trembling slightly in his hand. "It's something else. It's like it's alive." Determined to find an end and fueled by a surge of adrenaline, I suggested we keep playing, but changing the rules as we went. "Maybe it's like a riddle," I said. "Maybe ending the game as the crow flies means we need to not follow the rules directly. Crows don't fly straight. They diverge, they play, they trick." Nodding, though I could see the skepticism and fear mingled in their eyes, we each drew a card once again, ignoring the original instructions and instead doing the opposite of whatever was asked. As we diverged from the game's demands, the air around us grew tense, electric. Scott drew a card that told him to confess a fear, but he shared a hope instead. Elsie pulled one that instructed her to stand in a corner. She sat down in the center of the room. My card was the most chilling, "close your eyes until your next turn," and I kept them deliberately wide open. With each act of defiance, the room's temperature dropped. The darkness seemed to press closer and whispers filled the corners. Yet none dared from where. But we continued, increasingly desperate, fighting against the tightening grip of terror with every turn. The game didn't like it. That much was clear. The board began to shake, a subtle but undeniable vibration that set our nerves further on edge. The carved bone pieces rattled against the wooden surface like teeth in a cold grin. Finally, I drew another card. My hands shook so much that I almost dropped it. The command was new, unambiguous, and terrifyingly simple. End the game now. We stared at each other, uncertain. This was it, our possible release, or our ultimate trap. I grabbed the board and threw it to the ground, breaking it across the knee-jolted floor, shattering bone pieces and tearing cards apart in a frenzied release of all our pent-up terror. The lights flickered back to life, a harsh, sudden illumination that felt like the glare of a spotlight. We blinked against it, breathless, looking around the now-still room, the remains of Veritas scattered and inert. Had we won? Or had the game merely decided we were no longer entertaining? The silence that followed was unlike any before, a deep, resonant peace, or perhaps a lurking judgment. The faint echo of our actions hung in the air like a specter, reminding us that some games, once begun, leave traces that never fully dissolve. Our breaths caught in unison as we waited, watched, and wondered. What comes after the game has played you? As the stillness deepened, its stark contrast to the recent cacophony was uncomfortable, almost unbearable. We stood huddled together, the remnants of Veritas lying defeat. Amongst us, our eyes darting nervously around the room that no longer seemed merely a room, but a witness to something undefined. Should we leave? Elsie's voice was a whisper, bordered by the edge of hysteria. Her suggestion hung in the air, fragile and laden with unspoken fears of what lay beyond the door. Scott answered with a decisive no. Not yet. We don't know if it's over. His words fell like stones into a pond, their ripples a reminder of our precarious reality. We need to be sure. Sure of what? I retorted, frustration and exhaustion battling within me. That we're not trapped in some endless loop, that it doesn't have any more tricks to throw at us. Exactly, Scott confirmed grimly. He bent down, examining the game's wreckage with a critical, almost obsessive eye. We need to understand if breaking it really ended it. And so we waited, the minutes ticking by as heavy and slow as the darkness that had once enveloped us. The room felt laden with the echo of our actions. Each breath we drew a reminder of the ordeal. Anxiety pulsed beneath my skin, a relentless reminder that our perceived victory could be as illusory as the game's rules. Suddenly, the room shifted. Not physically, there was no tremor, no movement, but perceptually. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepened, making the familiar feel foreign. Our eyes met, the same realization dawning in each pair. The game wasn't confined to its pieces. The house, Elsie murmured, her eyes wide with the shock of insight. The game, it's tied to the house itself, isn't it? When we started playing, something woke up. It made a horrific kind of sense. The power outage, the oppressive atmosphere, the way the game had reacted to our defiance. We had thought we were playing a game on a board, but perhaps the board was just a conduit, a focal point for something much larger, something that had permeated the very walls that enclosed us. We need to leave, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Now. No one disagreed. We moved towards the door tentatively, each step laden with the weight of 1,000 possibilities. As Scott reached for the handle, the light above flickered violently, a palpable threat. He paused, hand inches from the door, and looked back at us with unmistakable fear. Maybe it's not letting us leave, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I reached out, placing my hand firmly on his. Together, I said, more a plea than a statement. We turned the handle, half expecting resistance, perhaps a supernatural force holding the door shut. But there was nothing. The door swung open easily, and the cool night air brushed our faces, an almost forgotten caress. Outside, the world looked untouched, the usual night sounds filling the air with mundane life. But the relief was superficial, skin-deep. Behind us, the house loomed, its windows dark eyes watching. The game might have been silenced, but we felt its gaze, its awareness. As we stepped hesitantly onto the porch, a part of me feared the crunch of our steps was an irreversible decision, a final play in this unwinnable game. We walked away from the house, each step echoing ominously in the quiet night. Underneath the crescent moon, we paused, looking back. The house was still, just a structure of wood and glass, yet it wasn't, could never be again, just a house. We had left, but had we escaped? Or had we merely moved to another part of the board, pawns yet under the game's rule, playing still though we no longer sat at its table? Silently, we agreed there was only forward to go, into the night, far from the remnants of Veritas. But as we turned away from the house, a cold thought whispered through my mind, chilling as the night air. Maybe the real game had only just begun. With no option but to keep moving, we pressed forward, our footsteps muffled against the soft, cold earth that seemed as reluctant to welcome us as it was to let us leave the horror behind. Every rustle of leaves felt like whispers from Veritas, urging us to turn back, or warning us of graver things that lay ahead. "Hey, look!" Scott's voice broke through the dense fog of our collective tension. He was pointing towards something on the ground a few feet ahead, an object that, at first glance, seemed to belong to the natural world around us. But as we drew closer, the moonlight revealed it wasn't a part of the forest floor at all. It was a small, intricately carved piece of wood, unmistakable as one of the game's pawns. Here, miles away from the house, it sat. "We destroyed it," Elsie whispered, her voice trembling. "How is it here? How?" No one had an answer. We stood there, enveloped by the eerie feeling of déjà vu, the sensation that we were rewalking steps already taken. I picked up the pawn, inspecting it under the moonlight. It was untouched by the violence that had upended the actual game board. "We need to keep moving," I said, pocketing the sinister piece. "The further we get, the bet." "Arr! But what if it's following us?" Elsie's voice was nearly a sob now. "What if we can't get away?" "We keep trying." My voice was firmer than my conviction. We trudged forward into the darkness that seemed to thicken with every step. Trees blended into shadows, and the shadows into whispers of movement, as if nature itself was conspiring to blur the line between paranoia and reality. After what felt like hours but must have only been minutes, the forest began to clear. We emerged into a small clearing, the moon bright and bold above us, casting everything in a stark, silvered relief. A part of me expected to find some new horror awaiting us. Instead, it was quiet, unnervingly so. Our eyes searched the tree line, half hoping, half dreading to find something there that could explain everything. A clue, a symbol, another piece of the game. But there was nothing, only the same oppressive silence we had become all too familiar with. "Okay," Scott started, his voice cutting through the quiet. "We need to think. What do we actually know?" "We know the game seemed linked to the house," I said. "But now it appears it's not just the house. It's us." "The game," Elsie added, "it's not just a board game. We're still playing it, aren't we? It didn't need the pieces or the board. It never did." "We're the pieces," I concluded, a chill settling deep within me. "What do we know about the game's rules?" Scott pressed, attempting to sound optimistic. "Nothing," I responded. "It changes, it adapts, but it definitely wants something from us. Or it wants to keep us in play," Elsie suggested quietly. We stood in silence. The truth was, we knew frighteningly little, and this ignorance made each decision heavy with potential doom. "Do you remember?" Scott said slowly, almost hesitant to continue. "Do you remember seeing or doing anything that might give us a clue? Anything unusual before tonight?" Memories flickered, reluctant, and shadowed by the ensuing chaos. Then it struck me, the moment the game changed, the intensity in the room grew was when we made choices out of desperation, not strategy. "We tried to rush it," I murmured. "Every time we tried to quickly end the game to escape it, things got worse." "So we play it slowly," Elsie said, hope threading through her words. "We keep moving, but carefully. We look for a real end, not just an escape." It was a plan formed more of necessity than confidence, but it was all we had. We moved on, this time more deliberate in our steps, the echo of our movement under the pensive gaze of the moon. As we walked, I kept my hand wrapped around the pawn in my pocket, as if by holding it, I could control it. But deep down, a new dread was forming, spurred by the cold notion that had crept into my mind earlier. We were moving, yes, but towards what end? The fear was palpable, that the real game had indeed only just begun, and it was a game without end, where the night held more than darkness and the shadows more than uncertainties. The real game was all around us, and we, unwittingly, were its most involved players.